A man stands alone on frozen ground, his rifle aimed at nothing but the wind. Around him, a circle of silent riders closes in, 50 armed warriors, unmoving as stone. He has no escape, no defense, and no idea that saving one dying horse would bring an entire nation to his doorstep. This is the story of the line he crossed without knowing, and the test that would decide if mercy was enough to keep him breathing. If you want to know whether he survives what comes next, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ridge had no name. Caleb Mercer preferred it that way. Names brought attention, and attention brought people, and people brought trouble he'd spent the last 3 years avoiding. His ranch sat tucked against the Montana high country, where the wind cut through wool like it wasn't even there, where winter arrived in October and didn't leave until May. Most folks considered it too remote, too harsh, too lonely. Caleb considered it perfect. He'd built the place himself after the war, not the kind fought with armies, but the personal kind that leaves a man hollowed out and looking for somewhere to disappear. The cabin was small, functional, nothing more. A single room with a stove, a bed, and a table he rarely used. The barn was larger, better insulated, because the horses mattered more than he did. He had 4 of them. Good stock, quiet company. Caleb didn't talk much, even to himself. He rose before dawn, worked until his hands ached, and slept hard when the day finally let him. He didn't ride into town unless he needed salt or ammunition, and even then he kept his head down and his words few. The townsfolk had stopped asking questions about him. They'd learned he didn't answer. It was late November when everything changed. The snow had been falling steady for 2 days, the kind that piled up soft and deep, muffling the world until it felt like the only sound left was your own breathing. Caleb had been checking his fence line along the river when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light through the trees. But shadows didn't move like that, labored and stumbling, and shadows didn't leave dark trails in the snow. He approached slowly, one hand resting on the rifle slung across his back. The shape resolved itself as he got closer. A horse, massive and black, its coat matted with ice and something darker. Blood. It had collapsed near the water's edge, steam rising from its heaving sides, its legs folded beneath it in a way that said it wouldn't be getting up again. Caleb stopped a few feet away. The horse's eye rolled toward him, white-rimmed and wild, but it didn't try to rise. Didn't have the strength left. He could see the brands on its shoulder now, symbols he didn't recognize, burned deep and deliberate. Not ranch marks. Something else. Easy, he said quietly, though he didn't know if he was talking to the horse or himself. He should have walked away. That was the smart thing. The safe thing. A horse this far from anywhere, marked like that, bleeding out in the snow, it meant complications. It meant someone was looking for it. It meant trouble he didn't need. But Caleb had seen enough dying in his life to recognize it when it stared back at him, and he'd made a promise to himself after the last time. No more walking away. Not from this. He knelt in the snow beside the animal, moving slow, keeping his voice low and steady. All right, let's see what we're working with. The wounds weren't from predators. They were too clean, too precise. Cuts across the flanks, deep gouges along the ribs. Someone had done this deliberately. The thought made something cold settle in Caleb's chest, colder than the wind. He worked quickly, got his coat off and wrapped it around the horse's head to keep it calm, then used his belt as a makeshift tourniquet on the worst of the bleeding. The animal trembled beneath his hands but didn't fight him. Maybe it understood. Maybe it was just too far gone to care. "You're a long way from home," Caleb murmured, "wherever that is." It took him the better part of an hour to get the horse on its feet. He used ropes, leverage, and more swearing than he'd done in months. When it finally stood, shaking and unsteady, Caleb half expected it to bolt. Instead, it leaned into him, nearly knocking him over, and he found himself bracing against 1,000 pounds of exhausted animal with nowhere to go but forward. "Barn," he said, as if the horse could understand. "Come on!" One foot, then the other. The walk back took another hour. The snow kept falling. The horse stumbled twice, and both times Caleb thought that was it, that he'd been a fool to try, that he should have just let nature take its course. But both times the animal found its feet again, and both times it kept moving. By the time they reached the barn, full dark had settled over the ridge. Caleb's hands were numb, his shoulders screaming, and his breath came in harsh clouds that hung in the frozen air. He got the horse into an empty stall, piled it with every blanket he owned, and set about cleaning the wounds properly. The brands bothered him. He'd seen cattle marks, horse marks, even some of the old military stampings from cavalry remounts. These were none of those. The symbols were intricate, layered, deliberate. They meant something to someone, and that someone had sent this horse out here to die. "What'd you do?" Caleb asked the darkness. The horse's ears flicked toward him, but offered no answers. He spent the night in the barn, checking the animal every few hours, making sure the bleeding had stopped, that infection wasn't setting in. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, he finally let himself doze off, slumped against the stall door with his rifle across his lap. When he woke, the world had gone quiet in the wrong way, the kind of quiet that meant something was watching. Caleb was on his feet before his mind fully caught up, the rifle already in his hands. The barn door stood open. He knew he'd closed it, and beyond it, the snow-covered yard stretched out pale and blue in the pre-dawn light. And all around it, in a perfect circle, stood riders. 50 of them, maybe more. Mounted on horses that stood motionless as statues, their breath rising in slow plumes. The riders themselves were wrapped in heavy furs and leather, their faces shadowed, their hands resting easy on weapons that ranged from rifles to bows to things Caleb didn't have names for. They didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there in that terrible, patient silence. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, but his hand stayed steady on the rifle. He'd been in bad situations before. This one just happened to be worse than most. The circle parted. A single rider came forward, moving with the kind of authority that didn't need announcement. The man was older, his face lined with years and weather, his eyes sharp as winter stars. He wore no visible weapons, but Caleb had the distinct impression he didn't need any. The rider stopped 10 feet from the barn, looked at Caleb, looked at the open door behind him, then spoke in a voice that carried without effort. "You have taken something that does not belong to you." Caleb's throat was dry, but he kept his voice level. "Found a dying horse. Fixed it. That's all." "That is not all." The man's gaze was unwavering. "That animal is sacred. It was marked, sent to the spirits, and you intervened. It was bleeding out in the snow. It was meant to." Silence fell again, heavier this time. Caleb felt the weight of every eye on him, felt the tension in the air like a drawn bowstring. He'd stumbled into something far bigger than he'd understood, and there was no easy way out. "I didn't know," he said finally. "Didn't see any spirits, just saw something suffering." The older man studied him for a long moment. Then he dismounted, smooth and deliberate, and walked forward until they were face to face. Up close, Caleb could see the scars that marked the man's hands, the beadwork stitched into his collar, the silver threads woven through his hair. "My name is Kalen," the man said. "I lead the people whose line you crossed. That horse was my son's. He died in battle, and the horse was sent to join him. You stopped that journey." Caleb's stomach went cold. "I didn't mean... Intent does not change action." Kalen's voice was calm, factual. "You interfered with the sacred. There are consequences." "Then take the horse back." "It is not that simple. The horse chose to live. It followed you. That cannot be undone." Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle, though he knew it wouldn't help. "So what happens now?" Kalen looked past him, into the barn, where the black horse stood watching them both. Something flickered in the old man's expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted just slightly. "Now, we see if you told the truth." "About what?" "About why you saved it." Before Caleb could respond, Kalen raised one hand. The circle of riders stirred, a subtle shift that felt like the earth itself rearranging. 2 of them dismounted and approached, carrying something between them. A saddle, ornate and old, its leather worked with the same symbols that marked the horse. "You will ride Stormfire to the summit of Black Hill," Kalen said. "Alone. If your heart was pure, if you acted without deceit, the horse will carry you. If you lied, if you sought to steal what was ours, it will know, and it will cast you down." Caleb's mouth went dry. "And if I refuse? Then we will know your answer." There was no good choice here, no way to talk himself out, no way to fight. Just a test he didn't understand, with stakes he couldn't measure. He looked at the horse. It looked back, dark eyes steady and unreadable. "All right," Caleb said quietly. Let's get this done. They brought Stormfire out of the barn, and Caleb saw for the first time just how massive the animal truly was. 18 hands, maybe more, with a presence that seemed to fill the yard. The wounds he'd stitched were still visible, but the horse moved without hesitation, its strength already returning. The riders fixed the saddle in place with practiced efficiency, their movements reverent. When they stepped back, Kalen gestured toward the horse. "Mount." Caleb approached slowly. Stormfire's ears flicked forward, tracking him, but the animal didn't shy away. He put one foot in the stirrup, tested his weight, then swung himself up into the saddle. The horse didn't move. Caleb settled himself, found the reins, took a breath. Around him, the circle of riders watched in absolute silence. "Black Hill," Kalen said, pointing toward a dark rise in the distance, barely visible through the snow. "Ride." Caleb touched his heels to the horse's sides. Stormfire surged forward. The world blurred. The horse moved like storm and shadow, like something that had never been tamed, only tolerated. Caleb gripped the saddle, felt the raw power beneath him, and understood suddenly that this wasn't about control. It was about trust. He loosened the reins, let the horse choose its path. They flew across the snow-covered plateau, past frozen creeks and stands of pine, the land rising steadily beneath them. The cold bit into Caleb's face, stole his breath, but he didn't fight it, just held on and let Stormfire run. The hill loomed ahead, steep and treeless, its summit lost in low clouds. The horse didn't slow. It hit the slope at full speed, hooves finding purchase on rock and ice, climbing with a sureness that defied reason. Halfway up, Caleb felt something shift. The horse's rhythm changed, steadied, and he realized it was no longer running from something. It was running toward. They broke through the clouds at the summit. The wind howled, vicious and cold, but the view stretched out forever, ridge after ridge of wild country, untouched and endless. Stormfire stopped, stood perfectly still. Caleb sat there, lungs burning, heart pounding, and waited for whatever came next. The horse turned its head, looked back at him with one dark eye, and Caleb felt something pass between them. Not words, not understanding, exactly, just a recognition that they'd both survived something, and that survival meant something here. Slowly, carefully, he dismounted. His legs nearly buckled, but he stayed upright. Stormfire watched him, ears forward, breathing steady. "I didn't know what I was doing," Caleb said to the wind, to the horse, to whatever was listening. "I just couldn't let you die." The horse lowered its head, nudged him once, gentle, then turned and started back down the hill. Caleb followed. The descent took longer. The adrenaline was wearing off, and every muscle in his body screamed protest. But Stormfire moved carefully now, picking its way down the slope, and Caleb kept pace beside it. When they reached the bottom, the circle of riders was still there, still waiting. Kalen stepped forward. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture had changed. He looked at Caleb, then at Stormfire, then back again. "The horse returned," he said simply. "It chose you." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Kalen studied him for another long moment. Then he nodded, once, sharp and final. "You may keep your life. The horse is no longer sacred. It has made its own path. But you have crossed into something you do not understand, and there will be consequences beyond this moment." "What kind of consequences?" "That remains to be seen." Kalen turned to the assembled riders. "We leave." As one, the circle began to dissolve. Riders wheeling their horses, disappearing back into the hills as silently as they'd come. Within minutes, the yard was empty except for Kalen and one other figure. A woman, younger, her face half hidden by a fur-lined hood. Kalen mounted his horse, looked down at Caleb one last time. "You were honest. That matters. But honesty does not erase action. Remember that." Then he was gone, riding into the pale morning light. The woman remained. She dismounted smoothly, approached Stormfire, ran one hand along the horse's neck with a familiarity that spoke of years. Then she looked at Caleb, and he saw eyes the color of smoke and flint. "My name is Leora," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. "I am Kalen's daughter, and I'm staying." Caleb blinked. "Why?" "Because the horse chose you, but it still belongs to us. Someone needs to make sure you understand what that means." I didn't ask for this. No, Leora agreed. She pulled the hood back, revealing dark hair braided tight against her skull, a scar running from her temple to her jaw. But you have it anyway, so we start there. She walked past him, into the barn, as if she'd been doing it her whole life. Caleb stood in the snow, exhausted and confused, with a sacred horse and a stranger who'd just claimed his barn, and realized with a sinking certainty that his quiet life on the ridge was over. Stormfire snorted, shook its mane, and followed Leora inside. After a long moment, Caleb did the same. The fire in the stove had gone out hours ago. The barn was warmer anyway, insulated by hay and the heat of the animals. Leora had already claimed a corner, spread out a bedroll, and was checking Stormfire's wounds with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "You did decent work," she said without looking up, for someone who didn't know what he was dealing with. "I know horses. You know ranch horses. This is different." Caleb leaned against the stall door, too tired to argue. "How long are you planning to stay?" "As long as it takes." "For what?" Leora finally looked at him. "For you to understand that saving one life can tie you to 100 others. For you to learn what you've stepped into. For Stormfire to decide if you're worth the choice it made. And if I'm not," she shrugged, "then I take the horse, and you go back to whatever you were doing before. Hiding, probably." The word hit harder than it should have. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm not hiding." "Sure." Leora turned back to the horse. "You just live alone on a ridge nobody can find, avoid town, and don't talk to anyone. That's called living." "It's called minding my own business." Was. Past tense. She stood, dusted off her hands. "You don't get to mind your own business anymore. Not after this." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to tell her to leave, to take the horse and the complications and the judgment in her voice and go back to wherever she came from. But he was too tired, and some part of him, the part that had knelt in the snow beside a dying animal, knew she was right. "There's hay in the loft," he said finally. "Help yourself." Leora nodded. "Appreciate it." He turned to go, then paused. "Why did your father send the horse to die?" Her expression shuddered. "Because my brother asked him to. Before he died. Said the horse should follow him, that it was the only thing left that mattered." She was quiet for a moment. "Father honored that. Until you interfered. I'm sorry for your loss." "Are you?" Leora's eyes were hard. "Or are you sorry you got caught?" Caleb met her gaze. "I'm sorry your brother's dead. I'm not sorry I saved the horse." Something shifted in her face. Not quite approval, but maybe respect. "Good. Don't ever be sorry for that. Just be ready for what comes after." She turned back to Stormfire, and Caleb took that as his dismissal. He walked back to the cabin through snow that was falling again, thick and silent, covering the tracks the riders had left. By morning, it would look like nothing had happened, like the world was still the same. But it wasn't. And Caleb knew, standing in his empty cabin with the stove cold and the silence pressing in, that it never would be again. He built the fire back up, made coffee, sat at the table and stared at nothing. Somewhere in the barn, a horse that had chosen him was being watched over by a woman who didn't trust him. Somewhere in the hills, a circle of warriors had decided his life was worth keeping, for now. And somewhere in the distance, the summit of Black Hill waited under clouds, a place where truth had been tested and, somehow, he'd passed. Caleb didn't feel like he'd won anything. He just felt tired. But when dawn came, he'd get up. He'd do the work. He'd face whatever Leora decided to teach him, whatever test came next. Because that was what you did when you made a choice and lived with it. You kept going. The coffee was bitter. The cabin was cold. And for the first time in 3 years, Caleb Mercer wasn't alone. He wasn't sure yet if that was a good thing. But he was about to find out. The first 3 days passed in a silence so thick it felt like another presence in the barn. Leora worked around Stormfire with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from a lifetime spent with horses. And Caleb kept to his usual routines, checking fence lines and hauling water and pretending this was all perfectly normal. They moved around each other like two rivers that refused to touch, careful and deliberate, until the space between them became its own kind of conversation. On the fourth morning, Caleb walked into the barn to find Leora already awake, leaning against Stormfire's stall with her arms crossed and her expression thoughtful. "You ever broken a horse?" she asked without preamble. Caleb set down the bucket of feed he'd been carrying. Broken plenty. That's not what I asked. He stopped, considered her. What's the difference? Breaking means you win and they lose. What I'm asking is if you've ever worked with one until you both understood each other. Same thing. It's not. Leora pushed off the stall door, walked over to where Caleb stood. Up close, he could see the scar on her jaw more clearly, the way it pulled slightly when she talked. Breaking leaves them functional but hollow. Understanding leaves them whole. There's a difference. Sounds like splitting hairs to me. Then you don't know horses as well as you think you do. The words should have stung, but they didn't, mostly because Caleb suspected she was right. He'd trained horses to work, to carry, to obey. He'd never thought much about what they understood or didn't. So teach me, he said. Leora studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Get a halter. We're starting over. They spent the next 2 weeks doing everything Caleb thought he already knew how to do, except slower and with more attention to things he'd never considered mattered. Leora showed him how to read the angle of Stormfire's ears, the tension in the animal's shoulders, the subtle shifts in weight that meant the horse was nervous or curious or getting ready to bolt. She made him stand in the stall for an hour at a time without moving, just breathing, until Stormfire stopped watching him like a threat and started ignoring him like furniture. Horses don't trust fast, she explained one afternoon while they worked. They trust consistent. You want Stormfire to accept you, you need to be the same person every time you walk in here. I am the same person. Are you? Leora leaned against the barn wall, her expression skeptical. Because from where I'm standing, you're someone who wanted to be left alone, got dragged into something bigger, and now you're trying to figure out if you regret it. That's 3 different people fighting inside one body. Horse can feel that. Caleb gritted his teeth. You don't know anything about me. I know you live alone on purpose. I know you avoid town like it carries plague. I know you've got exactly 4 horses and no friends, and you prefer it that way. She tilted her head. I also know you knelt in the snow to save something that was dying, even though it would have been easier to walk away. So yeah, maybe I don't know everything, but I know enough. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she was making assumptions based on nothing, but the words stuck in his throat because they weren't true, and lying to her felt like more effort than it was worth. Fine, he said instead. So what do I do about it? You pick which person you want to be and commit. The horse doesn't care which one you choose. It just needs you to choose. That night, Caleb sat in the cabin with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands and thought about who he'd been before he came to the ridge, before the war, before the loss, before the decision to disappear. He'd been someone who laughed easier, who trusted quicker, who believed the world was fundamentally worth the trouble of living in it. That person felt like a stranger now, separated by years and grief and the kind of exhaustion that settled into your bones and never left. But he'd also been someone who'd walked away from a dying horse once, back when he was younger and harder, and he'd regretted it every day since. That memory had been the one that made him stop when he found Stormfire bleeding in the snow. It had been the thread connecting who he'd been to who he was trying to become. Maybe that was enough to start with. The next morning, he walked into the barn and found Leora already working with Stormfire, running a brush over the horse's coat in long, rhythmic strokes. She looked up when he entered, raised an eyebrow. You look like you didn't sleep. Didn't much. Thinking? Too much of it. Leora nodded like that made perfect sense. Good. Means you're taking this seriously. She held out the brush. Your turn. Caleb took it, moved into the stall. Stormfire's ears flicked toward him, tracking his approach, but the horse didn't shift away. He started brushing, slow and steady, the way Leora had shown him. The repetitive motion was soothing, mindless in a way that let his thoughts settle. Tell me about your brother, he said after a while. Leora went still. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she leaned against the stall door, her gaze distant. His name was Kyle. He was 2 years younger than me, but you'd never know it from how he acted. Always the first one into a fight, the last one to back down. Brave to the point of stupid. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. He loved this horse more than anything. Raised it from a foal, trained it himself. When he rode into battle, he told my father that if he didn't come back, Stormfire should follow him. Said it was the only companion he'd ever need in this life or the next. What happened to him? Ambush. 20 against 5. Cale took down half of them before he fell. Her voice was flat, matter-of-fact, but Caleb could hear the weight beneath it. By the time we got there, he was already gone. Stormfire was standing over him, covered in blood. Wouldn't let anyone near. I'm sorry. You already said that. I mean it. Leora looked at him, really looked, and some of the hardness in her expression softened. I know you do. That's why I'm still here. They worked in silence for a while longer. When Caleb finally stepped out of the stall, Stormfire followed him to the door, leaned its head over the gate, and huffed warm breath against his shoulder. It was the first time the horse had initiated contact, and Caleb felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. Progress, Leora said quietly. Maybe. Definitely. She pushed off the wall, stretched. Come on, you've been avoiding town long enough. We need supplies. Caleb's stomach sank. I can go alone. You could, but you won't. Leora was already heading for the door. Because I need to see how people react to you, and you need to stop hiding. I'm not hiding. She shot him a look over her shoulder. Keep telling yourself that. Maybe eventually you'll believe it. The ride into town took most of the morning. Caleb hadn't been down the mountain in over a month, and the trail was rough with ice and fallen branches. Leora rode one of his other horses, a steady mare named Copper, and kept pace beside him without complaint. She didn't talk much during the journey, just watched the landscape with the kind of attention that said she was cataloging everything, every rise, every hollow, every place someone could hide or be hidden. You always this paranoid, Caleb asked. You always this careless. I know this land. Knowing and paying attention aren't the same thing. Leora gestured toward a stand of trees off to the left. Someone's been through there recently. 2 riders, maybe 3. Tracks are a few days old. Caleb looked where she pointed. He could see the disturbance now that she'd mentioned it, the way the snow had been pressed down and refrozen in patterns that didn't match the wind. He'd ridden past it a dozen times and never noticed. Could be hunters. Could be. Leora didn't sound convinced. Could be scouts. Scouts for what? For whoever's been watching this ridge since you saved that horse. The word sent a chill down Caleb's spine that had nothing to do with the cold. You think someone's tracking me? I think you interfered with something sacred, survived a test most people don't, and now you've got a target on your back whether you want it or not. She met his eyes. My father let you live because the horse chose you. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with his decision. So what am I supposed to do about it? Stay alert. Stop assuming you're alone just because you can't see anyone. Leora urged her horse forward, and maybe start trusting that I'm here for a reason. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The town was called Benson's Fork, a collection of maybe 30 buildings strung along a frozen creek that would run fast and loud come spring. Most of the structures were wood, weathered gray by wind and time, with smoke rising from chimneys in thin white columns. A few people moved between buildings, bundled against the cold, but the main street was mostly empty. Caleb tied his horse outside the general store and stepped onto the porch, Leora close behind. The moment he pushed through the door, the warmth hit him like a wall, along with the smell of coffee and tobacco and the dry goods scent of flour and beans. The store was run by a man named Harlow, a barrel-chested former trapper who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite and decided indoor work was safer. He looked up from behind the counter when they entered, and his expression went carefully neutral. Mercer, he said. Been a while. Harlow, Caleb nodded. Need to stock up. Figured as much. You only come down when you're out of everything. Harlow's gaze shifted to Leora, lingered. Who's your friend? Leora. She's staying at my place for a bit. The words felt strange coming out, like admitting to something he hadn't fully processed yet. Harlow's eyebrows went up, but he didn't comment, just nodded and gestured toward the shelves. Help yourself. I'll get your account ready. Caleb moved through the store, pulling down flour and salt and coffee, the essentials he couldn't make or grow himself. Leora wandered the aisles beside him, her fingers trailing over canned goods and dried fruit, her expression thoughtful. You don't come here much, she observed. Don't need to. Or don't want to. Caleb didn't answer. He carried his selections to the counter where Harlow was waiting with a pencil and a ledger. That everything? The shopkeeper asked. Should be. Harlow tallied the numbers. his lips moving slightly as he worked. When he finished, he looked up. $42. You want to settle now or add it to your tab? Tab's fine. All right. Harlow made a note, then hesitated. Mercer, you hear about the trouble up north? Caleb's hand paused on the bag of flour. What trouble? Couple of ranchers got burned out last week. No one killed, but their stock was scattered and their barns torched. Marshall thinks it might be raiders, but no one's claimed responsibility. That's 100 miles from here. Was 100 miles. They found tracks heading south. Harlow's expression was serious. Just thought you should know. Being up on that ridge alone and all. I'm not alone, Caleb said before he could stop himself. He felt Leora's eyes on him, but didn't look over. But I appreciate the warning. They loaded the supplies onto the horses and were halfway out of town when a voice called out behind them. Hey, you there! Caleb turned to see a man approaching, tall and rangy, with a marshal's star pinned to his coat. His name was Brennan, and Caleb had met him once before, shortly after moving to the ridge. The marshal had come by to introduce himself, make sure Caleb wasn't running from the law, and generally establish that he expected people in his jurisdiction to stay out of trouble. Marshal, Caleb said evenly. Mercer. Brennan's gaze flicked to Leora, then back. Heard you had company. News travels fast. It does when people are curious. Brennan stopped a few feet away, his hands resting easy on his belt. Mind if I ask who your friend is? Leora stepped forward before Caleb could answer. My name's Leora. I'm staying with Mr. Mercer temporarily. Is that a problem? Depends. Brennan's tone was mild, but his eyes were sharp. You from around here? No. Where then? North. That's not much of an answer. It's the one you're getting. Leora's voice was calm but firm. Unless you've got a legal reason for asking. Brennan's jaw tightened. I've got a legal obligation to know who's in my territory and why, especially with raiders moving through. I'm not a raider. Didn't say you were. But you're also not being particularly forthcoming, which makes me wonder why. The tension in the air ratcheted up a notch. Caleb stepped between them, keeping his voice level. Marshal, I vouch for her. She's not causing trouble. You vouch for her. Brennan's gaze didn't waver. That's real reassuring, Mercer, given that I don't know you much better than I know her. Then we've got a problem, Caleb said quietly. Because I'm not explaining myself to you or anyone else. If she's broken a law, arrest her. If not, we're leaving. For a long moment, Brennan didn't move. Then he stepped back, his expression unreadable. All right, but if there's trouble, I'll be looking your way first. Fair enough. They mounted their horses and rode out of town without looking back. Caleb could feel eyes on them from windows and doorways, could sense the weight of judgment and curiosity pressing down like a physical thing. By the time they cleared the edge of town, his shoulders were tight with tension. That went well, Leora said dryly. Could have been worse. Could have been better. She glanced at him. You didn't have to step in like that. Yeah, I did. Why? Caleb didn't have a good answer for that. Or maybe he did, and he just wasn't ready to say it out loud. So he urged his horse forward and let the silence fill the space between them. They were halfway back to the ridge when Leora pulled her horse to a stop. Caleb reined in beside her, following her gaze to the tree line. What is it? Someone's watching. Caleb scanned the trees but saw nothing. You sure? I'm sure. Leora's hand moved to the rifle strapped to her saddle. 3 of them, maybe 4. They've been following since we left town. Could be the marshal. Could be, but I don't think so. She dismounted smoothly, tied her horse to a low branch. Stay here. Like hell. Leora shot him a look. You want to help? Keep the horses calm. If I'm wrong, I'll come back and apologize. If I'm right, you'll hear gunfire. Before Caleb could argue, she was gone, moving into the trees with the kind of silence that said this wasn't her first time hunting something that didn't want to be found. He waited, every muscle tense, his hand resting on his own rifle. The minutes stretched out, long and uncomfortable. The horses shifted, uneasy, and he murmured to them without thinking, the same low reassurances he'd used on Stormfire. Then he heard it. Not gunfire, but voices, low and urgent, too far away to make out words. A moment later, Leora emerged from the trees, her rifle in hand and her expression grim. We need to move. Now. What did you see? 4 riders, armed. They're not locals. How do you know? Because they're wearing the same marks as the men who killed my brother. Caleb's blood went cold. You're sure? I'm sure. Leora was already untying her horse. They're not here for me. They're here for you, or for Stormfire. Maybe both. Why? Because some people didn't agree with my father's decision to let you live, and they're here to correct what they see as a mistake. They rode hard, pushing the horses faster than was safe on the icy trail. Caleb's mind raced, trying to piece together what this meant, what he was supposed to do about it. He'd survived the test, passed whatever judgment Kaelin had imposed, but apparently that hadn't been the end of it. When they finally reached the ridge, the cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, peaceful, untouched. But Caleb didn't trust the appearance anymore. He'd learned enough in the last few weeks to know that stillness could hide a lot of threats. They dismounted quickly, moved the horses into the barn. Stormfire was waiting in its stall, ears pricked forward, and Leora went to the horse immediately, running her hands over its neck in a gesture that looked as much like reassurance as inspection. What do we do? Caleb asked. We prepare. Leora straightened, her jaw set. They'll come at night. That's when they think we're weakest. How many? At least 4, maybe more. She met his eyes. You know how to fight? I've been in fights. That's not what I asked. Caleb thought about the war he'd tried to leave behind, the battles that still woke him up some nights with his heart pounding and his hands shaking. He thought about the men he'd killed, the ones he'd watched die, the weight of survival that never got lighter no matter how much time passed. Yeah, he said quietly. I know how to fight. Good. Leora pulled her rifle down, checked the chamber. Because we're about to. They spent the rest of the daylight hours preparing. Caleb moved ammunition into the cabin, checked his weapons, barricaded the windows with shutters he'd built but never used. Leora worked on the barn, setting tripwires and creating sight lines, her movements efficient and practiced. By the time darkness fell, the ridge had been transformed into something defensible, not impenetrable, but better than it had been. Caleb stood in the cabin doorway, watching the last light fade from the sky, and felt the familiar weight of waiting settle over him. Leora appeared beside him, her rifle slung over one shoulder. You scared? Should I be? Probably. She leaned against the door frame. But fear keeps you sharp. It's when you stop being scared that you get sloppy. You scared? Terrified. She said it so matter-of-factly that it took him a moment to realize she meant it. But I've been terrified before. I know what to do with it. What's that? Use it. Leora pushed off the doorframe, started back toward the barn. Get some rest if you can. I'll take first watch. Caleb wanted to argue, to say he should take first watch, that this was his problem and she shouldn't be carrying it. But he was exhausted, and she was right. Fear kept you sharp. And he needed to be sharp when the fighting started. He lay down on the bed without undressing, his rifle beside him, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep felt impossible, but it came anyway, dragging him down into darkness. He woke to the sound of gunfire. Caleb was on his feet up before he was fully awake, rifle in hand, heart hammering. The gunfire came again, 3 sharp cracks from the direction of the barn, followed by shouting. He threw open the cabin door and immediately dropped to one knee as a bullet splintered the doorframe inches from his head. Muzzle flash lit up the darkness near the tree line. At least 2 shooters, maybe more. Caleb fired back twice, aiming for the flashes rather than targets he couldn't see, then rolled left and scrambled behind the water trough. His breath came fast and ragged, the cold air burning his lungs. Leora! He shouted. Barn! Her voice carried from somewhere in the darkness. 3 on the north side, 2 coming around east, Caleb swore under his breath. 5 that they knew about, could be more. He peered over the trough, saw movement near the barn, and fired again. Someone yelled, whether from being hit or just startled, he couldn't tell. Return fire kicked up snow and dirt around him, forcing him back down. This wasn't sustainable. He was pinned, exposed, and running through ammunition faster than he could afford. He needed to move, needed to get to better cover, but the open ground between the cabin and barn might as well have been a mile wide. Then he heard the sound that changed everything. Hoofbeats, heavy and fast, coming from the barn. Stormfire burst into the yard like a black thundercloud. Leora clinging to its back with no saddle and only a fistful of mane for control. The horse moved with terrifying speed, cutting between Caleb and the shooters, providing a moving barrier that drew fire away from him. "Move!" Leora screamed. Caleb didn't think. He just ran. Sprinted across the open ground while bullets tore through the air around him, his boots slipping on ice, his lungs screaming. He made it to the barn and threw himself through the door, landing hard on the packed dirt floor. Leora was right behind him, sliding off Stormfire in one smooth motion. The horse wheeled around, blocking the doorway with its body, ears pinned flat and nostrils flaring. "How many did you see?" Caleb gasped. "5 for sure. Could it be 6? Leora was already moving, checking sightlines through gaps in the barn walls. "They're not trying to kill us yet, just pin us down." "Why?" "Because they want the horse alive." She glanced back at Stormfire. "Everything else is negotiable." Caleb crawled to one of the gaps, peered out. The shooters had pulled back slightly, taking cover behind trees and rocks. Waiting. The silence after the gunfire was almost worse than the noise had been. "We can't stay here," he said. "Can't run either. They've got the high ground and better position." Leora ejected the spent shells from her rifle, reloaded with practiced efficiency. "We hold until dawn, then we reassess. That's 4 hours. I can count." Another volley of gunfire raked the barn. The horses in the other stalls screamed and kicked, terrified. Caleb fired back blindly, just to let the attackers know they weren't defenseless, then ducked as return fire punched holes through the wooden walls. "This is because of me," he said. The words tasted bitter. "Because I saved the horse. This is because some people think their version of sacred matters more than someone's life." Leora's voice was hard. "Don't take their burden on yourself." "Easy for you to say, is it?" She looked at him, and in the dim light filtering through the bullet holes, her eyes were fierce. "You think I don't carry guilt? My brother died because I wasn't there, because I was somewhere else, doing something I thought mattered more. I've been living with that for 8 months, so don't tell me what's easy." Caleb opened his mouth to respond, but a new sound cut through the darkness. Hoofbeats again, but more of them this time. A lot more. He risked a glance through the gap and felt his stomach drop. At least a dozen riders were emerging from the tree line, moving in a loose formation that suggested coordination and experience. At their center rode someone Caleb recognized even in the darkness. Kalen. The old chief raised one hand and the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the harsh breathing of frightened horses and the creak of saddle leather. "Mercer," Kalen's voice carried across the yard. "I would speak with you." Leora grabbed Caleb's arm before he could move. "Don't. It could be a trap. Or it could be the only chance we have to end this without more blood." He pulled free gently. "Your father let me live once. Maybe he'll do it again. And maybe he's here to correct that mistake. Only one way to find out." Caleb stood, kept his rifle lowered but ready, and stepped into the barn doorway. Stormfire moved aside just enough to let him through, then positioned itself between Caleb and the yard like a living shield. Kalen dismounted and walked forward alone, stopping about 20 feet away. In the moonlight, his face was unreadable, but his posture was relaxed, not the stance of someone preparing to attack. "You have caused me considerable trouble, Caleb Mercer," the chief said. "Wasn't my intention." "Intentions matter less than consequences." Kalen gestured toward the riders who'd been shooting at them. "These men believe you stole what was sacred. They believe my judgment was compromised by sentiment, by the fact that the horse chose you. They want me to rectify that error." "And what do you believe?" "I believe the horse made its choice for reasons we do not fully understand. I believe you acted without malice, and I believe that killing you now would dishonor both my son's memory and the test you survived." Kalen's gaze was steady. "But I am not the only voice in this matter." One of the riders who'd been shooting spurred his horse forward. He was younger than Kalen, with a hard face and eyes that burned with something that looked like rage and grief mixed together. "The outsider defiles sacred ground," the younger man shouted. "He keeps what should have been returned. This cannot stand." "Dakota," Kalen said quietly, "we have discussed this. And I have heard you, but I do not agree." Dakota's hand moved to the rifle strapped to his saddle. "The law is clear. What is marked for the spirits cannot be reclaimed by the living. The horse chose, Kalen said, his voice harder now. That choice supersedes law. Convenient, especially when your daughter sleeps in his barn. The words hit like a slap. Kalen went very still, and even from a distance, Caleb could see the anger that flashed across the old chief's face. Be very careful with your next words, Dakota. I speak only truth. Your judgment is compromised by sentiment, by the hope that this outsider might— Enough! Kalen's voice cracked like a whip. You overstep, then prove me wrong. Take back the horse. Send your daughter home. Show us that sacred law still means something. The silence that followed was brutal. Caleb felt every eye in the yard turn toward him, felt the weight of judgment and expectation pressing down like a physical thing. He could give up the horse, could tell Leora to go, could solve this entire problem by backing down and returning to the isolation he'd known before any of this started. But that would mean abandoning something that had chosen to trust him. That would mean letting fear dictate his choices, and he'd promised himself, after the war, that he wouldn't do that anymore. No, he said quietly. Kalen turned to look at him. No? The horse stays. Leora stays. If that's a problem, then we have a problem. Caleb's grip tightened on his rifle. But I'm not giving up either of them just because it's easier. Even if it costs your life? Even then, Dakota laughed, harsh and bitter. The fool signs his own death warrant. So be it. He was reaching for his rifle when Stormfire moved. The horse surged forward with shocking speed, positioned itself directly between Dakota and Caleb, and screamed. The sound was primal, aggressive. Nothing like the quiet animal that had been recovering in the barn for weeks. Dakota's horse shied violently, nearly throwing him. The other riders' mounts danced and backed away, spooked by the display. Only Kalen's horse held steady, though even it tossed its head nervously. Stormfire held its ground, every muscle tense, its dark eyes fixed on Dakota with unmistakable challenge. The horse defends him, one of the other riders said, his voice awed. It chooses the outsider over its own people. It has been corrupted, Dakota snarled, turned against us. Or it recognizes something we do not, Kalen said slowly. He was staring at Stormfire with an expression Caleb couldn't quite read. My son raised this horse from birth, trained it, bonded with it. If anyone understood its nature, it was Kael. And Kael asked that it be sent to join him. He paused. But what if that was not the horse's destiny? What if it was meant for something else? You speak heresy, Dakota said. I speak possibility. Kalen turned to face his riders. We marked this horse sacred and sent it to die. But it did not die. It was saved by a man who had no obligation to save it, no knowledge of what it represented. And when tested, that man proved his heart was true. The horse then chose to defend him, to stand between him and death, as it once stood for my son. He raised his voice. Who are we to deny what the spirits have clearly decided? The spirits did not decide this. Dakota's face was twisted with fury. A weak old man decided it because he cannot accept that his son is gone. The words hung in the air like poison. Several of the riders shifted uncomfortably. Kalen's expression went cold and flat, the kind of calm that preceded violence. You will apologize, the chief said softly. Now. I will not. Then you will leave. Gather those who agree with you and go. You are no longer welcome among us. Dakota looked around at the other riders, clearly expecting support. A few met his eyes, but most looked away. The solidarity he'd been counting on wasn't there. You would cast me out over this? Over him? Dakota pointed at Caleb. I have fought beside you for 20 years. And now you question my leadership, insult my grief, and demand I betray what I know to be right. Yes, Dakota, I would cast you out. Kalen's voice was implacable. Choose, submit or leave. For a long moment, Dakota didn't move. Then he jerked his horse around and spurred it toward the trees. 3 other riders followed him, their faces hard and closed. The rest stayed where they were, waiting. When the sound of hoofbeats had faded, Kalen turned back to Caleb. That was not the end. You understand this? I do. Dakota will gather others who feel as he does. They will come again, and next time I may not be here to intervene. So what am I supposed to do? Survive. Learn. Become someone worthy of the choice the horse made. Kaylin's gaze shifted to the barn, where Leora had emerged, her rifle still in hand. And listen to my daughter. She knows more than you do about what is coming. What is coming? But Kaylin had already turned away, was already mounting his horse. The remaining riders fell in behind him, a silent procession that disappeared into the darkness as quickly as it had arrived. Caleb stood in the yard, exhausted and confused, trying to process everything that had just happened. Leora walked over to him, her expression unreadable. Your father knew, Caleb said, about you staying here. He knew. Of course he knew. I'm his daughter, not his prisoner. Leora looked toward where the riders had vanished. He hoped you'd prove worthy of the choice. Looks like you did. Didn't feel like proving anything. Felt like barely surviving. Same thing, most days. She turned back toward the barn. Come on, we need to check the horses and patch those bullet holes before we freeze to death. They worked through the rest of the night, repairing what could be repaired and salvaging what couldn't. The other horses had calmed down, though they were still skittish, their eyes rolling white whenever sudden movement startled them. Stormfire alone seemed unaffected, standing calm and alert in its stall, as if the violence had been nothing more than an inconvenience. As dawn broke pale and cold over the ridge, Caleb finally allowed himself to sit down. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline crash, and his shoulder ached where he'd landed hard on the barn floor. Leora sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. Thank you, he said quietly. For staying, for fighting. You already thanked me. I mean it more now. She smiled just slightly. I know. She was quiet for a moment, then added, My father was right, you know, about Dakota coming back. He won't let this go. I know. So we prepare. We train. We make sure that when he does come, we're ready. We? You think I'm leaving after all this? Leora shook her head. You're stuck with me, Mercer. At least until you learn how to defend yourself properly. I did fine tonight. You survived tonight. That's not the same as doing fine. She stood, stretched, winced at some injury she hadn't mentioned. But we can work on that, starting tomorrow. Today, we sleep. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he could handle whatever came next on his own. But the truth was, he didn't want to be alone anymore. The silence that had once felt like sanctuary now felt like isolation. And the difference mattered. Tomorrow, he agreed. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely comforting. Leora pushed Caleb harder than he'd been pushed in years, teaching him to fight the way her people fought, fast and brutal and efficient, with no wasted movement and no hesitation. She taught him to read the land the way she did, to see the signs that someone had passed through, to anticipate where an attack might come from. You're thinking like a rancher, she said one afternoon after he'd failed to spot an obvious ambush point for the third time. You need to think like prey, because that's what you are now. Encouraging. It's not supposed to be encouraging. It's supposed to keep you alive. She pointed to a cluster of rocks overlooking the trail. See that? Yeah. How many people could hide there? Caleb studied the formation. 3, maybe 4. 6 if they don't mind being uncomfortable, and they won't, because comfort matters less than advantage. Leora climbed up to the rocks, demonstrated how someone could flatten themselves into spaces that looked too small. You're looking for obvious threats. The dangerous ones aren't obvious. He started paying more attention after that. Started seeing the world the way she did, as a collection of potential dangers that needed to be cataloged and prepared for. It was exhausting, that level of vigilance, but it was also effective. He stopped being surprised by things. Stopped assuming safety just because he couldn't see threats. Stormfire became part of the training too. Leora worked with both Caleb and the horse, teaching them to move together, to trust each other's instincts. It was different from anything Caleb had done before, less about control and more about partnership. The horse would respond to pressure from his legs, shifts in his weight, changes in his breathing. And Caleb learned to read the horse the same way, to feel when it was nervous or curious or preparing to bolt. You're getting better, Leora said one morning after they'd completed a particularly difficult exercise. Still not great, but better. High praise. It's accurate praise. There's a difference. She dismounted, ran her hand along Stormfire's neck. The horse trusts you now. That's significant. Doesn't feel significant. It is. Trust is earned slowly and lost quickly. You've earned this. She looked at him, and there was something in her expression that Caleb couldn't quite name. Don't waste it. The town remained a problem. Caleb had to go down for supplies every few weeks, and each time the reception grew colder. People who'd nodded politely before now crossed the street to avoid him. Shopkeepers who'd been friendly became terse and businesslike. And Marshal Brennan watched everything with the kind of attention that suggested he was waiting for an excuse. They're scared of you, Leora observed after one particularly uncomfortable trip. Or scared of what you represent. I don't represent anything. You represent change, disruption. The idea that their quiet little world isn't as isolated as they thought. She glanced at him. People hate that. I didn't ask for any of this. Doesn't matter. You're the face of it now. Might as well accept it. But accepting it was harder than she made it sound. Caleb had come to the ridge to escape exactly this kind of attention, this kind of complication. And now he was neck deep in both, with no clear path back to the simplicity he'd once known. The only bright spot was the work itself. The rhythm of the days, the slow progress with Stormfire, the quiet conversations with Leora in the evenings when the work was done and the world had gone dark. She talked about her brother sometimes, about the life she'd had before everything changed. Caleb found himself talking too, sharing things he hadn't spoken about in years. The war, the losses, the reasons he'd chosen isolation over connection. You can't hide forever, Leora said one night. They were sitting in the barn, the horses settled and quiet around them. Eventually you have to decide if you're living or just surviving. What's the difference? Living means you let people in. Surviving means you keep them out. She looked at him. Which one are you doing? Caleb didn't have an answer for that. Or maybe he did, and he just wasn't ready to admit it. Winter deepened and the snow piled higher, transforming the ridge into something both beautiful and brutal. The cold was constant, bone deep, the kind that made every breath hurt and every movement feel like work. But they managed, fixed what broke, adapted to what couldn't be fixed, and kept moving forward. Then, 6 weeks after Kalen's intervention, the scouts appeared. Caleb saw them first, distant shapes moving along the far ridge, too deliberate to be deer and too organized to be random travelers. He counted 5, maybe 6, all on horseback, all moving with purpose. Leora confirmed it an hour later. They're mapping approach routes, testing our awareness, getting ready. For what? For whatever Dakota has planned. She lowered the scope she'd been using, her expression grim. He's been gathering support, building his case. My father heard rumors that he's got maybe 20 fighters now, people who think the old ways are being abandoned. 20 against 2, great odds. 20 against 3, Leora corrected. Stormfire counts. Still not great. No, she agreed. It's not. They prepared as best they could. Set more traps, established fallback positions, stockpiled ammunition and supplies. Caleb even rode into town one last time, ignoring the cold stares and hostile whispers, and bought enough provisions to last through a siege if it came to that. Marshal Brennan stopped him on the way out. Whatever you're preparing for, Mercer, I hope it's worth it. So do I. You could leave, sell the ranch, move on. No shame in that. Caleb looked at the marshal, saw genuine concern beneath the suspicion. There's plenty of shame in running from something just because it's hard. There's also wisdom in knowing when you're outmatched. Maybe, but I'm not there yet. He rode back to the ridge, the marshal's words echoing in his head. He could leave, could pack what mattered and disappear before Dakota made his move. It would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But when he reached the cabin and saw Leora working with Stormfire in the yard, both of them moving in perfect synchronization, he knew he wasn't going anywhere. This place, these people, this strange tangled mess he'd stumbled into, it mattered. More than safety, more than wisdom, maybe even more than survival. Leora looked up as he approached, raised an eyebrow. You look like you made a decision. I did. And? We stay, we fight, we see it through. She smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her. Good. I was hoping you'd say that. That night they sat together in the barn, the horses quiet around them, and planned for war. Not because they wanted it, but because it was coming whether they wanted it or not. and when it arrived, they intended to be ready. Outside, the wind howled across the ridge, carrying snow and cold and the promise of violence. But inside, there was warmth and purpose, and something that felt almost like hope. Caleb didn't know if they'd survive what was coming, didn't know if choosing to stay was brave or stupid or some combination of both. But he knew he'd made the right choice. And for the first time in 3 years, that was enough. The attack came on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the scouts had disappeared. Caleb had been mending fence when he saw the smoke rising from the direction of town, thick and black against the pale winter sky. His first thought was a house fire, an accident. Then he saw the second column of smoke and the third, and he knew. He ran for the cabin, shouting for Leora. She met him halfway, already armed, her face grim. "They're burning the town," she said. "Why?" "We're up here, not down there. Because Dakota wants you isolated, wants the town to blame you for what's happening." She was already moving toward the barn. "And it's working. Look." Caleb followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. A group of riders was climbing the trail toward the ridge, maybe a dozen of them, but these weren't Dakota's warriors. These were townspeople, farmers, and shopkeepers he recognized, their faces twisted with anger and fear. Marshal Brennan rode at their front, and when he got close enough, Caleb could see the conflict written across his features. The marshal reined in his horse about 50 yards from the cabin, raised one hand to halt the group behind him. "Mercer," he called, "we need to talk." Caleb stepped forward, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. "I didn't burn your town, Brennan. Maybe not directly, but those fires started right after a group of armed riders came through asking about you, asking where you lived, how to get here, how many people you had with you." Brennan's voice was hard. "You brought this down on us." "I didn't bring anything. I saved a horse and tried to mind my own business." "Well, your business is burning our homes," one of the other men shouted, his face red with rage. "My store's gone. Everything I had. And you think killing me fixes that?" Caleb kept his voice level. "Dakota did this to turn you against me. Don't give him what he wants." "What I want," Brennan said slowly, "is for this to end. Whatever you did, whatever you took, give it back. Make peace with these people. Let us go back to our lives." "The horse isn't mine to give back. It chose to stay." "Then unchoose it," another man yelled. "We don't care about your excuses. We care about our town." The crowd behind Brennan was getting more agitated, their voices rising, their hands moving toward weapons. This was spiraling fast, moving toward violence that wouldn't solve anything, and would only give Dakota more ammunition. Leora stepped up beside Caleb. "You're being used," she said, her voice carrying across the distance. "Dakota burned your town to make you angry, to make you blame Caleb instead of him. And it's working." "Who the hell are you?" someone demanded. "Someone who knows Dakota better than you do. He doesn't care about your town or your stores. He cares about punishing someone who defied what he thinks is sacred law. You're just tools to him." "Convenient story," Brennan said. "How do we know you're not just protecting him? Because if we wanted to hurt you, we could have done it already. We've had plenty of chances." Leora's gaze swept across the assembled riders. "Instead, we've stayed up here, minded our business, and tried not to cause trouble. The only one causing trouble is Dakota." "Then where is he?" Brennan challenged. "If he's the problem, why isn't he here?" As if in answer, gunfire erupted from the tree line behind the townspeople. 3 of them went down immediately, their horses screaming and bolting. The rest scattered, diving for cover, their anger forgotten in the face of actual danger. Dakota and his warriors emerged from the trees, a line of mounted fighters moving with precision and purpose. They didn't charge, didn't rush, just advanced steadily, their weapons ready, their faces cold. "This is what mercy gets you," Dakota shouted. "The outsider lives and your town burns. Your families suffer because a weak old man chose sentiment over justice." Brennan scrambled behind a boulder, his rifle up. "We're not your enemy, Dakota." "You chose your side when you came here to defend him," Dakota gestured toward Caleb. "Now you pay the price." More gunfire. The townspeople were trying to return fire, but they were farmers and merchants, not fighters. They were outmatched and they knew it. Several more went down, wounded or worse, and the rest were trapped between Dakota's warriors and the cabin. Caleb made a decision. "Leora, get them to cover. The barn." "Are you insane? They just tried to—" "I know. Do it anyway." She stared at him for a second, then nodded and ran toward the scattered townspeople. This way! Move! Some of them hesitated, clearly unsure whether this was a trap. But bullets were flying and the barn offered protection, so they followed. Caleb provided covering fire, shooting toward Dakota's line, not to hit anyone but to make them keep their heads down. It bought enough time for Leora to get maybe 8 of the townspeople into the barn, including Brennan. The marshal stumbled through the door, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. Why are you helping us? Because Dakota's wrong, Caleb said simply. And you don't deserve to die for his grudge. Outside, Dakota's warriors had stopped advancing. They held position at the edge of the yard, a semicircle of armed riders that blocked any escape route down the mountain. Dakota himself sat at the center, his expression unreadable. You cannot win this, Mercer, he called. Surrender the horse and the woman, and I will let these others leave. Not happening, Caleb shouted back. Then you all die. Their blood is on your hands. Their blood is on yours. You burned the town. You attacked them. I showed them the truth, that protecting you brings only suffering. Dakota's voice rose. You are a disease, outsider, a corruption that spreads until everything it touches turns rotten. Brennan looked at Caleb. He really believes that. I know. So what do we do? Caleb didn't have a good answer. They were pinned down, outnumbered, with limited ammunition and no help coming. The smart play would be to surrender, to give Dakota what he wanted and hope he kept his word about letting the townspeople go. But Caleb had learned enough about men like Dakota to know that surrender wasn't safety. It was just a different kind of death. We hold, he said finally, and we wait for an opening. An opening for what? I'll know it when I see it. The standoff stretched into hours. Dakota's warriors didn't attack again, just maintained their position and waited. It was a siege strategy, designed to wear down the defenders through exhaustion and fear. And it was working. The wounded townspeople were suffering, their groans filling the barn, and there was no way to treat them properly with bullets still flying whenever anyone showed themselves. Leora moved among the injured, doing what she could with the limited supplies they had. She tore strips from her shirt to make bandages, used whiskey from Caleb's stores to clean wounds, and spoke in low, calm tones that seemed to ease the pain, if only slightly. You know medicine? One of the townsmen asked through gritted teeth. Enough to keep you breathing. Leora tied off a bandage around his leg. Try not to move too much. That bullet's still in there. How long can we hold out? Brennan asked quietly, pulling Caleb aside. Depends on what Dakota does. If he's patient, we've got maybe 2 days before we run out of water, less if he sets fire to the barn. Can't we negotiate? Offer him something? Like what? The only things he wants are things I won't give him. Brennan was quiet for a moment. The horse isn't worth dying for, Mercer. It's not about the horse. Not anymore. Caleb looked around the barn, at the frightened faces and bloodied bodies. It's about not letting someone tell you who you are and what you're allowed to do. That's pride talking. Maybe, but it's also principle. A shout from outside interrupted them. One of Dakota's warriors was riding forward, a white cloth tied to his rifle. A parley flag. Caleb moved to the barn door, stayed behind cover, but made himself visible. What do you want? The warrior stopped 20 feet away. Dakota offers new terms. Give him the horse, and he leaves. The woman can stay. You can stay. Everyone lives. And I'm supposed to trust that? You have my word. Your word means nothing if Dakota doesn't honor it. Caleb shook his head. The answer's still no. The warrior's expression didn't change. Then he says to tell you this. He has sent riders to the homesteads around the valley. Every ranch, every farm. He will burn them all, one by one, until you give him what he wants, and their deaths will be your doing. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Caleb felt the weight of every eye in the barn turn toward him, felt the calculation happening in their minds. How many lives was one horse worth? How many homes? How much suffering? He's bluffing, Leora said from behind him. He doesn't have enough warriors to cover that much ground. You sure about that? No, she admitted. But giving in won't stop him. It'll just prove that threats work. The warrior was still waiting for an answer. Caleb took a breath, steadied himself, and made the only choice he could live with. Tell Dakota I said no, and tell him if he burns one more building, I'm coming for him personally. The warrior nodded slowly, turned his horse, and rode back to the line. Caleb watched him go and felt the certainty settle in his chest that he'd just made everything worse. Brennan grabbed his arm. You just condemned those people. Maybe. Or maybe I called his bluff and saved them. Caleb pulled free. Either way, giving in wasn't going to help. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Because men like Dakota don't stop. You give them what they want, they just want more. The only way to end this is to stand firm or to kill him. So which one are we doing? Caleb looked out at the line of warriors, at Dakota sitting tall in his saddle, confidence radiating from every line of his posture. I'm working on that. Night fell, and with it came a bitter cold that crept through every gap in the barn walls. The injured were suffering more now, shivering despite the blankets, their breathing labored. One of them, an older man Caleb recognized from the general store, wasn't going to make it through to morning. Everyone could see it, but nobody said anything. Leora sat beside the dying man, holding his hand, speaking too quietly for Caleb to hear. When the man finally stopped breathing, she closed his eyes gently and stood up, her face expressionless. We can't stay here, she said. Not like this. You have a better idea? Several, none of them good. She moved to where Stormfire stood in its stall, the horse alert and watching everything. But maybe one that could work. I'm listening. Dakota wants the horse, so we give it to him. Caleb felt his chest tighten. Leora. Let me finish. We give him the horse, but we give it to him our way, on our terms, with a trap built in. What kind of trap? She smiled, sharp and dangerous. The kind where he thinks he's won right up until the moment he loses. They planned through the night, speaking in whispers, refining the details until they had something that might actually work. It required trust, timing, and a significant amount of luck. But it was better than waiting to die. When dawn broke pale and cold, Caleb walked out of the barn with his hands raised and his rifle left behind. Dakota's warriors tensed, weapons coming up, but their leader raised one hand to stay them. You surrender? Dakota called. I'm offering a deal. You are in no position to offer anything. Maybe, but hear me out anyway. Caleb stopped in the middle of the yard, exposed and vulnerable. You want the horse? I'll give it to you, but only if you let everyone else go. The townspeople, Leora, all of them. They walk away free, and you get what you came for. Dakota studied him, suspicion clear on his face. Why would you do this? Because I'm tired of people dying over something I never asked for. Because that man in the barn died last night, and I don't want anyone else's death on my conscience. Caleb kept his voice level. You wanted me to understand consequences. Well, I understand. Now let's end this before more people pay for my mistakes. And what happens to you? Whatever you decide, I'm not asking for mercy, just for everyone else to go free. Silence stretched across the yard. Dakota dismounted, walked forward until he and Caleb were face to face. Up close, the man was younger than Caleb had thought, maybe 30, with eyes that burned with conviction and grief in equal measure. You think I am the villain in this story, Dakota said quietly. I think you're someone who lost something important and doesn't know how to grieve it. I know exactly how to grieve, with justice, with adherence to the laws that kept us strong for generations. Dakota's voice hardened. You disrupted that. You took what was sacred and made it common. For that, there must be punishment. Then punish me, not them. Dakota considered this. Then he nodded. Very well. Bring out the horse. When I have it, the others may leave. Caleb turned and walked back to the barn, his heart hammering. This was the moment where everything could fall apart, where trust either held or shattered. Leora met him at the door, Stormfire already saddled beside her. The horse's ears were forward, alert but calm. She handed Caleb the reins and leaned in close. You sure about this? No, but we're doing it anyway. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, then we improvise. He managed a smile. We're good at that. She touched his arm briefly, a gesture that carried more weight than words, then stepped back. Caleb led Stormfire out into the yard, the horse moving easily beside him. When he reached the center, he stopped and held out the reins. Here, take it. Dakota approached slowly, his eyes on the horse rather than Caleb. When he reached for the reins, Stormfire's ears went back. The horse shifted, uneasy, but didn't bolt. Dakota took the leather straps, pulled them taut, and for a moment looked almost sad. "My friend died for this animal," he said quietly. "Rode it into battle, trusted it with his life. And it was sent to join him because that trust deserved honor." He looked at Caleb. "You stole that honor, tainted it with your interference. I saved a life, that's all." "You saved nothing. You only delayed." Dakota swung himself into the saddle in one smooth motion. "Now everyone sees that mercy is weakness, that the old ways are dying because men like Kalen value sentiment over strength." He dug his heels into Stormfire's sides. The horse exploded forward, not in flight but in fury. It reared, screaming, its front hooves striking air, and Dakota fought for control with skill born of experience. But Stormfire wasn't interested in being controlled. It spun, bucked, twisted in ways that would have thrown any normal rider. Dakota held on. Barely. His face was set in grim determination, his hands locked on the reins, his legs clamped tight. The horse's rage was palpable, a living thing that filled the yard with violence and noise. And then Stormfire stopped, just froze mid-buck, every muscle tense, its sides heaving. It turned its head and looked directly at Caleb. The message was unmistakable. "Choose." Caleb whistled, a single sharp note, the same one Leora had taught him weeks ago during their training. The horse's ears pricked forward. Then it moved, powerful and deliberate, carrying Dakota not away from the barn but toward it. "What are you doing?" Dakota yanked on the reins. The horse ignored him. Stormfire stopped directly in front of the barn door, stood perfectly still, waiting. Caleb whistled again, a different pattern. The horse reared one more time, not in rage now, but in deliberate motion, and Dakota's grip finally broke. He tumbled backward, hitting the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Before he could recover, Leora and 3 of the townsmen were on him, weapons drawn, faces hard. "Don't move," Leora said quietly. Dakota stared up at them, then at Caleb, comprehension and fury warring across his features. "You tricked me. I offered you a deal. You took it. Not my fault you didn't understand what you were getting." Caleb walked over, stood looking down at the man. "The horse chose me. Not because I'm better than you or your friend. Not because I deserve it, but because I was there when it needed someone, and I didn't walk away. You can call that interference or corruption or whatever makes you feel better, but it's still a choice the horse made." "This changes nothing," Dakota spat. "Others will come. Others who see what you are." "Maybe, but you won't be leading them." Caleb looked at Brennan. "Marshal, you want to take custody of him? Pretty sure burning a town and attacking civilians breaks some laws." Brennan stepped forward, pulled Dakota to his feet with hands that weren't gentle. "Yeah, I'd say it does." The rest of Dakota's warriors had watched the whole thing unfold, their weapons lowered, their expressions uncertain. Without their leader, they looked younger, less sure. One of them, a woman maybe 20 years old, dismounted and approached slowly. "We didn't know," she said, "about the town. He told us it was strategy, that casualties were necessary for justice." "They usually are, when someone's more interested in being right than in being good," Leora said. Her voice wasn't unkind. "Go home. Tell Kalen what happened. Let him deal with Dakota." The woman nodded, relief clear on her face. She remounted, and the other warriors followed her lead. Within minutes, they were gone, riding back toward wherever they'd come from. The townspeople emerged from the barn slowly, wary and exhausted. They looked at Caleb with expressions that ranged from gratitude to lingering resentment to simple confusion. He understood all of it. This wasn't a clean victory, wasn't the kind of ending where everyone walked away happy. But it was an ending. And that counted for something. Brennan secured Dakota's hands with rope, then turned to Caleb. "What you did, the trick with the horse, that was smart. It was Leora's idea. Still smart, and still doesn't change the fact that your presence here brings trouble." The marshal's voice was tired. "I'm grateful you helped us, but I need you to understand that most people in town won't see it that way. They'll see burned buildings and dead neighbors, and they'll blame you for it." "I know. So what are you going to do?" Caleb looked at the ridge, at the cabin he'd built, the life he'd tried to create. Then he looked at Leora, who was tending to Stormfire, checking the horse for injuries with careful hands. And he thought about the choice the horse had made, the choice he'd made in return, and all the consequences that had followed. "I'm staying," he said. This is my home. I'm not leaving it because some people can't see past their fear. That's your right, but don't be surprised if it gets lonely up here. It was lonely before. At least now I know why. Brennan nodded slowly. Fair enough. I'll do what I can in town, try to make people understand what really happened, but I can't promise it'll help. I'm not asking for promises, just fairness. That I can try for. The marshal hauled Dakota toward his horse. Come on, let's get you somewhere with bars. As the marshal and the townspeople began their descent down the mountain, taking their wounded and their dead with them, Caleb stood in the yard and watched them go. The sun was higher now, burning away the morning frost, and the damage from the fighting was clearly visible. Bullet holes in the barn walls, blood staining the snow. The physical evidence of how close they'd come to disaster. Leora walked over, stood beside him. That could have gone worse. Could have gone better too. Always can. She was quiet for a moment. You really staying? Yeah, you? For a while. At least until spring. After that, she shrugged. We'll see. Fair enough. They stood there together. Two people who'd been strangers weeks ago and now found themselves bound by circumstance and choice in equal measure. The silence between them was comfortable now, familiar, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. Stormfire walked over, nudged Caleb's shoulder with its massive head. He reached up, ran his hand along the horse's neck, felt the trust that had been earned slowly and tested often. Thank you, he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the horse or to Leora or to something else entirely. For what? Leora asked. For staying, for fighting, for not letting me face this alone. You wouldn't have been alone regardless. The horse would have been here. That's not the same. No, she agreed, it's not. They went about the work of cleaning up, repairing what could be repaired, burying the man who died in the barn. It was grim work, exhausting work, but it was necessary. And somehow, doing it together made it bearable. As the sun set that evening, painting the ridge in shades of orange and gold, Caleb stood on his porch and looked out at the land he'd chosen. It didn't feel like isolation anymore. It felt like something else. Something harder to name, but easier to live with. Home, maybe, with all the complications that word implied. And for the first time since he'd arrived on this ridge 3 years ago, Caleb Mercer felt like he belonged exactly where he was. Winter gave way to spring slowly that year, the snow melting in reluctant patches that revealed brown grass and mud underneath. The ridge transformed from white silence to something alive again, with water running in the creek and birds returning to nest in the pines. Caleb watched the change happen and felt something similar occurring inside himself, though he couldn't have named it if asked. Leora stayed through the thaw. She'd said spring, and spring came, but she didn't mention leaving. Neither did Caleb ask her to. They'd fallen into a routine that worked, dividing chores without discussion, eating meals together in comfortable silence, working with the horses until even the skittish ones had calmed under her patient hands. The town remained distant. Caleb still rode down for supplies once a month, and the reception was cold but not hostile. People nodded instead of glaring. A few even spoke to him, brief exchanges about weather or road conditions that didn't go deeper but proved things had shifted. Marshal Brennan had kept his word about explaining what really happened, and while not everyone believed it, enough people did. That the worst of the anger had dissipated. Dakota had been sent east to face territorial justice. Word came back after 6 weeks that he'd been sentenced to 5 years hard labor for arson and assault. Kalen himself had testified against him, which surprised some people, but didn't surprise Leora at all. My father doesn't forgive betrayal, she said when Caleb mentioned it. Dakota turned against him, questioned his leadership publicly. That matters more than any shared history. Harsh way to live. It's the way we've survived. She was mending a saddle, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Trust is everything when you're constantly fighting to hold on to what's yours. Break it, and there's no coming back. You don't think people deserve second chances? I think second chances are a luxury. Some people earn them. Most don't. She looked up at him. Why? You planning to betray me and want to know if I'd forgive it? No, just trying to understand how you see the world. I see it as it is. Dangerous, unpredictable, and generally unfair, but also capable of surprising you when you least expect it. Her expression softened slightly. You surprised me. How? By staying, by not running when it got hard, by proving that sometimes people mean what they say. She went back to her work. That's rarer than you'd think. The conversation stuck with Caleb for days afterward. He'd never thought of himself as particularly trustworthy, just someone trying to get through each day without causing or experiencing more pain. But maybe that was its own kind of reliability. Maybe consistency mattered more than grand gestures or dramatic promises. He tested the theory in small ways. Said he'd fix the barn door and did it. Told Leora he'd checked the fence line and actually checked it. Kept his word on things that didn't seem to matter much individually, but apparently added up to something larger. And slowly, he noticed her relaxing around him, the guardedness in her eyes easing, her laughter coming more readily. They were working in the barn one afternoon when she asked about his past. Not the war, which they'd skirted around before, but what came before it. Who he'd been when he was younger, before loss had carved him into someone harder. I was going to be a doctor, Caleb said, surprising himself with the admission. Studied for 2 years, worked with a physician in St. Louis. Thought I'd spend my life helping people, fixing what was broken. What changed? The war started. They needed medics more than they needed students, so I enlisted. Figured I'd serve, learn more practical medicine, come back and finish my training. He paused. Didn't work out that way. Why not? Because I learned that most of what breaks can't be fixed. You can stop bleeding, set bones, stitch wounds. But you can't fix what war does to people inside. Can't mend the part that stops trusting, stops hoping, stops believing things will ever be okay again. He looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of ranch work. After a while, I stopped seeing the point. Seemed like all I was doing was keeping people alive long enough to get hurt worse. Leora was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, You saved Stormfire. That's different, is it? Horse was dying. You could have walked away, saved yourself the trouble. But you didn't. You stopped the bleeding, did what needed doing, kept it alive. She met his eyes. Sounds like doctoring to me. It was one horse. It was a choice. Same choice you could have made in the war, and didn't because you'd given up believing it mattered. Her voice was gentle but firm. Maybe the problem wasn't that you couldn't fix what was broken. Maybe it was that you stopped trying. The words hit harder than Caleb expected. He wanted to argue, to explain that she didn't understand the scope of what he'd seen, the futility of trying to heal wounds that just kept reopening. But looking at her face, at the scar running down her jaw, and the steadiness in her eyes, he realized she probably understood better than most. You ever give up on something? He asked. Yeah, on my brother, right before he died. We had a fight, stupid argument about whether he should ride into that battle. I told him he was being reckless, that he'd get himself killed trying to prove something. He said I was being a coward, afraid to take risks because I'd rather be safe than right. She touched the scar unconsciously. We didn't speak for 3 days, then he rode out, and I never saw him alive again. That's not giving up, that's just being human. Maybe, but it feels like giving up. Feels like if I tried harder, said the right thing, he might have listened. Might still be here. She shook her head. Point is, we all carry that weight. The things we didn't do, the words we didn't say. But carrying it doesn't mean we have to let it define everything that comes after. So what do we do with it? We use it. Let it remind us that chances matter, that people matter, that the things we choose to fight for actually mean something. Leora stood, brushed hay from her pants. And we stopped punishing ourselves for being imperfect at it. That night, Caleb sat on the porch long after Leora had gone to bed in the barn. The stars were bright overhead, sharper and clearer than they'd been during winter, and the air carried the smell of pine and wet earth. He thought about St. Louis, about the life he'd imagined having, about the man he'd planned to become. That version of himself felt impossibly distant now, separated by years and violence and deliberate isolation. But maybe he didn't need to be that person again. Maybe he could be someone else, someone who'd learned from breaking and was trying to figure out how to be whole again. It wasn't a comfortable thought, but it felt true in a way that mattered. Spring deepened into early summer, and with it came visitors. Not hostile ones this time, but Kaylin and a small group of riders who approached the ridge openly, their hands visible and weapons secured. Caleb watched them come with Leora beside him, her posture relaxed but alert. My father, she said unnecessarily. Should I be worried? Only if you've done something worth worrying about. Kalen dismounted when he reached the yard, his movements slower than Caleb remembered, but still carrying authority. The old chief looked at his daughter first, his expression unreadable, then at Caleb. "You have survived the winter," Kalen said. It wasn't quite a question. "We have." "And Dakota's rebellion?" "Ended. Brennan took him in. Last I heard, he was sentenced to labor." "I know. I testified at his trial." Kalen's gaze didn't waver. He dishonored himself and endangered my people through his actions. Justice was necessary. "I'm sorry it came to that." "Are you? Or are you simply saying what you think I wish to hear?" Caleb considered the question seriously. "Both, probably. I don't like seeing someone destroyed even when they brought it on themselves. But I'm also glad he can't hurt anyone else." Kalen nodded slowly. "An honest answer. Good." He looked at Leora. "You have been here many months, daughter. Your place is with your people." "My place is where I choose it to be," Leora said calmly. "You taught me that." "I taught you duty, responsibility, not to abandon your heritage for—" He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. "What is it you seek here that you cannot find among us?" "Peace," Leora said simply. "The chance to be something other than someone's daughter or someone's sister. To make choices that aren't weighted down by what everyone expects me to be." "And you find that here? With him?" "I find it doing work I choose with someone who doesn't expect me to be anything but myself." "Yes." Kalen's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he turned back to Caleb. "I came to offer you something. Acknowledgement before my people that you acted with honor, that the horse's choice was legitimate, and that you are not to be considered an enemy or outsider." "Why?" "Because continued conflict serves no one. Because my daughter has chosen to remain here, and I will not have her living under the shadow of our disapproval. And because you have proven yourself worthy of the trust that was placed in you, however reluctantly." Kalen's expression was serious. "This is not a small thing I offer. It carries weight, obligation. You would be expected to honor our customs when they touch upon you, to respect what we hold sacred. And in return, you would be left in peace. No more attacks, no more challenges. Your presence here would be accepted." Caleb looked at Leora, who gave him the smallest nod. Then he looked back at Kalen and made the only choice that made sense. "I accept, and I'll honor what you hold sacred, as long as it doesn't require me to compromise who I am." "Fair enough?" Kalen extended his hand. "Then we have accord." They shook, and Caleb felt the weight of it settle over him like a cloak. This was binding in ways he didn't fully understand yet, but it felt right nonetheless. Kalen stayed for dinner, which became an awkward but oddly comfortable meal, where the old chief told stories about Leora as a child, and she rolled her eyes but didn't actually object. When he finally left, riding back toward his people with his escort, Caleb felt something shift in the air. Not resolution exactly, but the beginning of it. "That went better than expected," he said. "He's proud, but he's not stupid." Leora was cleaning dishes, her hands moving in steady rhythm. "He knows I'm not coming back." This was his way of accepting it without losing face. "You really staying?" She stopped, turned to look at him. "Do you want me to stay?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither had fully acknowledged before. Caleb thought about the months they'd spent working together, fighting together, learning to trust each other in ways that went deeper than convenience. Thought about how the silence of the ridge had changed from lonely to companionable. How the work felt less like survival and more like building something. "Yeah," he said. "I do." "Why?" "Because you make this place feel less like hiding and more like living. Because I trust you in ways I haven't trusted anyone in years. Because—" He stopped, searching for words that felt true without being more than he was ready to admit. "Because things are better with you here." Leora smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to something that made Caleb's chest tight. "Good answer. So you're staying?" "For now. We'll see what happens when winter comes again." It was the most commitment either of them was ready to make, and that was fine. They had time. And time, Caleb was learning, mattered more than grand promises or dramatic declarations. Summer brought work of a different kind. Caleb had let parts of the ranch slide during the winter crisis, and now he needed to rebuild. Fences needed mending, The roof needed patching, and the vegetable garden he'd abandoned years ago needed to be cleared and replanted. Leora threw herself into the work with the same intensity she brought to everything else, and between them they made progress that would have taken Caleb months alone. They also began training together more seriously. Not just defensive work anymore, but riding, tracking, surviving in the wilderness. Leora taught him skills her people had refined over generations, and Caleb shared what he'd learned in the war and afterward. The exchange felt equal, reciprocal, neither of them playing teacher or student exclusively. One afternoon they were practicing mounted archery when Leora's shot went wide and she swore in frustration. "You're thinking too much," Caleb said. "I know what I'm doing wrong. That doesn't make it easier to fix." "So stop trying to fix it. Just feel where the arrow wants to go and let it." She gave him a skeptical look. "That's terrible advice." "Maybe. But it's what you told me about Stormfire. Stop trying to control. Start trying to understand." He grinned. "Figured turnabout was fair. Using my own words against me. Low tactic. Effective, though." She tried again, and this time the arrow flew true, hitting the target dead center. Leora lowered the bow, looking surprised. "Huh. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's something to listening to people who know what they're talking about. Don't get smug. It's unattractive." But she was smiling when she said it, and Caleb felt that now familiar warmth in his chest that came from making her happy. It was a simple thing, barely worth noting, but it mattered to him in ways he was still figuring out. The town slowly began reaching out again, not with friendship exactly, but with cautious acceptance. A few ranchers stopped by to ask advice about horse training, having heard Caleb knew more than most. He helped when he could, and word spread that he wasn't the troublemaker some had painted him as. Harlow at the general store started giving him fair prices again instead of the marked-up rates that punished outsiders. Marshal Brennan rode up to the ridge one afternoon in late July, his expression serious. "Got something you should know," the marshal said without preamble. "Dakota escaped custody 3 weeks ago. Killed a guard in the process." Caleb felt ice settle in his stomach. "Where's he now?" "Unknown. But there's been reports of someone matching his description heading west toward the mountains. Could be coming here. Could be going anywhere. Could be, but I figured you deserved the warning either way." Brennan shifted in his saddle. "You want protection? I can station a deputy up here for a while." "No, we can handle it." "You sure about that?" Caleb thought about everything they'd survived already, everything they'd built together. "Yeah, I'm sure." After Brennan left, Leora emerged from the barn where she'd been listening. "He'll come," she said flatly. "Dakota doesn't let things go." "I know. So what do? We prepare. Again. And we hope we're wrong." They weren't wrong. 2 weeks later, on a morning so beautiful it seemed cruel, Dakota appeared on the ridge alone. He sat on a horse at the edge of the clearing, making no move to advance, just watching, waiting. Caleb walked out to meet him, leaving his rifle behind but keeping a knife at his belt. Leora stayed near the barn, covering him with her weapon but not interfering. This felt personal in a way that required direct confrontation. "You came back," Caleb said when he was close enough. "I came to finish what should have been finished months ago." Dakota looked thinner, harder, his eyes carrying a wildness that hadn't been there before. "You took everything from me. My honor, my place among my people, my freedom. Now I take something from you." "I didn't take anything. You lost it through your own choices." Convenient perspective for the man who caused it all. Dakota dismounted slowly. "I don't want the horse anymore, don't want speeches or trials or justice. I just want you to understand what you cost me." "So what? You kill me? That doesn't get you anything back." "It gets me satisfaction, and that's enough." Dakota drew a knife, long and wicked-looking, its blade catching the sunlight. Caleb pulled his own weapon, shorter but well-balanced, and settled into a stance the war had taught him. This was going to happen. No talking his way out, no clever tricks. Just violence, pure and simple. They circled each other, both looking for openings. Dakota moved first, fast and aggressive, his blade seeking Caleb's ribs. Caleb blocked, countered, felt the shock of metal on metal run up his arm. They broke apart, circled again. "You're better than expected," Dakota said. "You're more desperate than I thought you'd be." Desperation focuses the mind. They came together again, and this time Dakota's blade got through, opening a shallow cut along Caleb's forearm. Blood welled up, hot and immediate. Caleb ignored it, pressed his advantage while Dakota was committed to the attack, and managed to score a hit across the other man's shoulder. Now they were both bleeding, both breathing hard, both knowing this would end with someone on the ground. The fight stretched on, brutal and graceless. Movies made knife fights look elegant, but the reality was ugly desperation and fear and pain. Caleb's arm was screaming where he'd been cut, his grip getting slippery with blood. Dakota was favoring his left side, the shoulder wound deeper than Caleb had initially realized. They broke apart again, both trying to catch their breath. "Why?" Caleb asked. "Why does it matter this much?" "Because I have nothing else left. You took my purpose, my identity. Without the fight, I'm just someone who failed." Dakota's voice was raw. "At least this way I die meaning something." And suddenly Caleb understood. This wasn't about the horse or honor or sacred laws. It was about a man who'd defined himself by conflict for so long that peace felt like erasure, who'd built his entire identity around being a warrior and didn't know how to be anything else. "It doesn't have to end this way," Caleb said. "You could walk away, start over somewhere else, build something new." "With what?" "I'm a fugitive with no people, no home, no purpose. There is no starting over." "There's always starting over. That's what I did. That's what Liora did. That's what everyone who survives does." "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You think you're the only one who ever lost everything? I walked away from a career, a future, a whole life, because the war broke something in me I didn't know how to fix. Spent 3 years hiding on this ridge because I couldn't face being part of the world again." Caleb lowered his knife slightly. "But I learned something. Giving up on yourself is easier than rebuilding, but it's also pointless. The only way forward is through." Dakota stared at him, and for a moment Caleb thought he might actually listen, might actually choose something other than violence. Then Dakota's expression hardened, and he lunged. Caleb sidestepped, barely, felt the blade whisper past his ribs. He brought his own knife up on instinct, muscle memory from the war taking over, and the blade found flesh. Dakota made a choked sound and stumbled back, his hand going to his side where blood was already spreading across his shirt. They stood there, both frozen, both realizing what had just happened. Dakota dropped to his knees, his face pale. "Finish it." "No. I came here to die with honor. Give me that much." "There's no honor in dying for nothing." Caleb moved forward, knelt beside him. "But there might be honor in choosing to live." "I can't." "Yes, you can. It'll be hard, and it'll hurt, and you'll probably hate every minute of it. But you can." Caleb pressed his hand over the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. "Liora, I need help here." She was there in seconds, her medical supplies already in hand. Together they worked on Dakota, stopping the bleeding, cleaning the wound, doing what could be done. The injured man didn't fight them, just lay there looking confused and empty, like he'd prepared for death and didn't know what to do with life. When the immediate crisis had passed and Dakota was stable enough to move, Caleb helped him into the cabin and onto the bed. The former warrior looked small suddenly, diminished, all the fire and fury burned out. "Why help me?" Dakota asked quietly. "After everything." "Buzz." "Because walking away from someone dying didn't work for me the first time. Not trying that again." Caleb pulled a chair over, sat down heavily. His arm was throbbing where he'd been cut, but Liora had already bandaged it. "And because you were right about one thing, everyone deserves to mean something, but you get to choose what that is. Doesn't have to be fighting. I don't know how to be anything else. Then learn. Same way everyone else learns. By trying, failing, and trying again." He paused. "You're going to have to face justice for the escape and the guard you killed. That's not negotiable. But after that, if you survive it, you get to decide who you become next." Dakota closed his eyes. "I don't deserve this mercy." "Probably not, but I'm not giving it because you deserve it. I'm giving it because I'm choosing to." Caleb stood up. "Now rest. We'll deal with everything else later." Marshal Brennan arrived the next day, summoned by a messenger Liora had sent. He took custody of Dakota, who went quietly this time, his fight completely gone. As the marshal led him away, Dakota looked back once. "Thank you," he said quietly, "even if I don't understand it." Caleb just nodded. He didn't need Dakota to understand. He barely understood it himself. After they'd gone, Leora sat beside him on the porch, her shoulder touching his. You could have killed him. I know. Most people would have. I'm not most people. Apparently. He flexed his bandaged arm, winced. Besides, I'm tired of death. Spent too many years surrounded by it. Maybe it's time to try something different. Like what? Like building instead of destroying, healing instead of hurting, choosing connection over isolation. He looked at her. Seems to be working so far. She smiled. It does, doesn't it? Summer faded into autumn, and the ridge transformed again, this time into a riot of gold and red as the aspen trees turned. Caleb and Leora worked through the harvest season, putting up vegetables, salting meat, preparing for another winter. But this time felt different. Less like bracing for survival and more like settling into a rhythm. They talked more now, about everything and nothing, shared stories from their pasts, dreams for the future, opinions about which of the horses was most stubborn. The conversations were easy, comfortable, the kind that came from genuine friendship rather than forced proximity. One evening in late October, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors, Leora said, I think I'm going to stay through winter again. Yeah, this place is starting to feel like home. She glanced at him. Or maybe it's the company that makes it feel that way. Could be both. Could be. She was quiet for a moment. My father came by last week while you were in town, offered me a formal position among our people, leading the horse training program. It's a significant honor. Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. Are you taking it? No. I told him I was needed here. She met his eyes. That was the truth, by the way. I am needed here, but it's also where I want to be. The relief that washed over Caleb was almost embarrassing in its intensity. I'm glad. Are you? Or are you just being polite? I'm terrible at being polite. You know that. He reached over, took her hand in his. It was the first deliberately intimate gesture either of them had made, and it felt both terrifying and exactly right. I'm glad because this place isn't the same without you. Because I'm not the same without you. Because somewhere along the way, you became the best part of my day. Leora's eyes widened slightly. Then she smiled, squeezed his hand. Took you long enough to say it. I'm slow about these things. I noticed, but that's okay. Some things are worth waiting for. They sat there as darkness fell, hands linked, neither feeling the need to rush toward anything more. This was enough. This moment, this connection, this quiet acknowledgement that they'd found something worth keeping. Winter came hard that year, with storms that buried the ridge under feet of snow and winds that rattled the cabin windows. But Caleb and Leora faced it together, and that made all the difference. They worked side by side, cared for the horses, kept the fires burning, and filled the long dark evenings with conversation and companionable silence in equal measure. The town continued its slow thaw toward acceptance. More people stopped by the ridge, some for advice, others just to visit. Caleb found himself becoming part of the community in ways he'd actively avoided before. It was uncomfortable at first, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but he adapted, learned small talk, to share meals with neighbors, to contribute to collective projects. Leora integrated too, though more slowly. Some of the townspeople remained wary of her, unable to fully separate her from the conflicts with Dakota and his followers. But she didn't seem to care much about their approval, which Caleb found both admirable and occasionally frustrating. You could try being friendlier, he said one day after a particularly awkward encounter in town. I could, but then I wouldn't be me. She shrugged. People either accept me as I am or they don't. I'm not changing to make them comfortable. Fair enough. Just seems like it might be easier if easier isn't always better. You taught me that. He had to concede the point. Spring returned, and with it came news that Dakota had been sentenced to 15 years for the guard's murder and the escape, but that he was reportedly a model prisoner, helping in the infirmary and teaching other inmates to read. Marshal Brennan passed along a letter Dakota had written, addressed to Caleb. The letter was short and awkward, the handwriting uncertain. But the message was clear. Dakota was trying to become someone different, someone better. He thanked Caleb for the mercy that had given him the chance, and he promised to make it mean something. You think he'll succeed? Leora asked after reading it. I think you'll try. That's all anyone can do. You're more optimistic than you used to be. Or more realistic. I've seen what happens when people give up completely. Maybe giving them another option is worth the risk. As the days lengthened and the land came back to life, Caleb found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself before. Not just survival, not just getting through each day, but actual plans. Things he wanted to build, goals he wanted to achieve, a life he wanted to create. He talked to Leora about expanding the ranch, taking on more horses for training, maybe even teaching others the techniques she'd shared with him. She liked the idea, started sketching plans for additional corrals and a proper training arena. They talked about it for hours, refining the vision, making it feel real. One night in May, after a particularly productive day, they sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge. The air was soft and warm, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, and everything felt possible in a way it hadn't before. I love you, Caleb said suddenly, the words surprising him even as they came out. Leora turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. You sure about that? Yeah, pretty sure. Actually, completely sure. He felt his heart hammering but pushed through the fear. I know I'm not great at this stuff, and I know I'm still figuring out who I want to be, but I know I want you to be part of whatever that turns out to be. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, that brilliant, transformative smile that made everything else fade away. Took you long enough to figure it out. Is that a yes? It's an I love you too, you idiot. She leaned over, kissed him gently. And yes, to all of it. The future, the plans, the life we're building. Yes. They sat there together as the night deepened, and Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not just happiness, though there was that, but genuine hope. The belief that tomorrow might actually be better than today, that the things he chose to fight for could actually work out. The ridge had been his sanctuary when he needed isolation, his fortress when he needed protection, his proving ground when he needed to learn who he could become. Now it was becoming something else entirely, a home shared with someone who understood him, challenged him, and made him want to be better. It wasn't perfect. They still fought sometimes, still struggled with their own demons, still had moments where the past felt heavier than the present. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. Summer brought the realization of their plans. They built the training arena together, along with help from a few townspeople who'd become genuine friends. Expanded the barn to accommodate more horses. Started taking in animals that needed work, either behavioral issues or physical recovery, and slowly built a reputation for patience and skill. Kaylin visited again in August, this time bringing Leora's mother, a woman who watched Caleb with sharp eyes before apparently deciding he was acceptable. The visit was still awkward, still colored by cultural differences and unspoken expectations, but it was warmer than before. Progress. You're good for her, Leora's mother said quietly while they were alone for a moment. I was not certain at first, but I see it now. I'm trying to be. That is all any of us can do. Try and hope we succeed more than we fail. She smiled slightly. My daughter does not give her heart easily. Protect it. I will. As autumn approached again, Caleb stood on the ridge and looked out at the land he'd claimed, the life he'd built, the future that stretched ahead. It looked nothing like what he'd imagined when he first arrived, desperate and broken and looking for a place to disappear. But it looked better, richer, full of possibility instead of just silence. Leora came up beside him, slipped her hand into his. What are you thinking? That I'm glad I stopped when I saw that horse dying in the snow, that I'm glad I didn't walk away. Me too. That everything that came after, all the violence and fear and uncertainty, was worth it to get here. Was it? Caleb thought about the question seriously. Thought about the people who'd died, the pain they'd all endured, the cost of the choices he'd made. It would be easy to say yes without qualification, to frame it all as necessary for a happy ending. But life wasn't that simple. Some of those costs had been too high. Some of that pain could have been avoided with better choices or more wisdom or just plain luck. The journey had been brutal in ways that still woke him up some nights, and pretending otherwise would dishonor everyone who'd suffered through it. I don't know if it was worth it, he said finally, but I know I wouldn't change it, because changing any of it might mean not ending up here, with you, building this. and I'm not willing to risk that. Good answer, Leora leaned against him. For what it's worth, I think it was worth it. All of it. Because we became who we needed to be through the struggle, and we found each other in the process. You're more optimistic than I am. Someone has to be. Otherwise, we'd just sit around being grim all the time. He laughed, and the sound felt good, natural, like something he could do without effort now. They stood there together as the sun set over the Montana high country, two people who'd been broken by different things and had somehow found a way to be whole together. It wasn't the ending Caleb had imagined when he'd chosen isolation 3 years ago. It was better, because he'd learned that hiding from pain didn't make you safe. It just made you lonely. That real strength wasn't in avoiding connection, but in choosing it despite the risk. That the things worth having were almost always the things that required you to be vulnerable, to trust, to believe that maybe this time things could work out. Stormfire watched them from the pasture, the horse that had started everything by refusing to die. It seemed content now, surrounded by other horses, no longer bearing the weight of being sacred or symbolic, just an animal living its life, which was exactly what it deserved. Thank you, Caleb said quietly, not sure if he was talking to the horse or to Leora or to whatever force had brought them all together. For what? Leora asked. For staying. For believing I was worth the trouble. For showing me what living actually looks like instead of just surviving. You did that yourself. I just helped. No. You did more than help. You saved me, same way I saved that horse, by refusing to walk away when it would have been easier. She kissed him, and in that moment everything else fell away. The past with all its pain, the future with all its uncertainty. There was just this, the present moment, two people choosing each other and choosing to build something together. When they finally pulled apart, Leora smiled. So what now? Now we keep going, keep building, keep choosing this life, even when it gets hard. Caleb looked out at the land, at the home they'd created, at the possibilities stretching ahead, and we see how far we can take it. Sounds good to me. They walked back to the cabin together as stars began to appear overhead, and Caleb felt something settle in his chest that he recognized after a moment as peace. Not the absence of struggle or pain or difficulty, but the certainty that whatever came, he wouldn't face it alone. The ridge wasn't lonely anymore. It was full of life and work and love and all the messy, complicated beauty that came from choosing connection over isolation. And that, Caleb thought, as he closed the cabin door behind them, was exactly what home was supposed to feel like. The story of the man who saved a sacred horse had become something else entirely. It had become the story of two people who saved each other, who built a life together out of wreckage and trust, who proved that sometimes the most sacred thing you can do is simply refuse to give up on someone, or on yourself. And on that frozen Montana ridge where winter had once meant only survival in silence, there was now warmth and laughter and the promise of tomorrow. It was more than enough. It was everything.